Good morning. As many of you know, and as Phil just said, I teach a graduate program in creativity to teachers. And through that work, over the years, I've become a bit of a curmudgeon on my topic of choice. You see, every year, at least once, sometimes several times in a year, with students or with colleagues or even at a cocktail party, I end up in a conversation that is something like this. Oh, you teach creativity, that's wonderful. I'm all for creativity. Of course, who's not for creativity? It's an awkward moment because I have to, at that point, say, I'm often not for creativity. Now, that is not because I'm against creativity in general. I am not some evil double agent. It is because, yes, it is because I think this idea has become extraordinarily important to our culture. It is an idea on which we are pinning a lot of hopes and one that has very broad reach. It is an idea about who we are and who we can become, how we educate, what our organizations do, and what our cultures are. I think we have to take it very seriously. And I believe, as a culture, we have to develop more nuanced and sophisticated ways of thinking about it. And one of those, there are a lot of issues that are involved in that more nuanced way of thinking, but one of those issues is when not to be creative. You remember those pesky mortgage-backed securities a few years ago? And the wunderkind who developed them and all the companies that marketed them? We tend to forget that back in the heyday, those were all called creative. Coming more closer to home for us, as someone who works in education, I fully believe that we need to integrate into education many of the skills and attitudes that psychologists like me research every day into our educational process. But it is a complex process to do that. It is not just storming the Bastille of old, stodgy, test-ridden education under the flag of creativity. We may do some Bastille storming, but we need more than a flag. You know, I work with extraordinary graduate students. And every year, really smart, motivated, dedicated teachers come into my classes saying, I just want my students to be creative. So I say, okay, let's look at the profiles of students who we know from longitudinal studies went on to have creative lives. And the enthusiasm sometimes dampens. My teachers were thinking more of smart, engaged students who do follow directions. And we tend to forget that creative students are difficult students. My teachers, by the way, are not just being naive or simple. They're really getting at a much more profound issue. What is education? It is primarily one of the ways we acculturate our youth, the ways we teach them our traditions, the way we teach them our ethics, the way we teach them the norms of our society. Now, you can develop curricula that both teach youth how to follow rules and break rules at the same time. I've seen it done, but it is not easy. And that's one of the reasons I think we really have to take this idea more seriously. I want to also admit up front that it's not like I always had this perspective. When I was a graduate student, creativity was a free ride. I was working with adolescents, and I was studying ironic thought patterns. Those of you who work with adolescents probably are not surprised by that. And I was also working with a very eminent scholar on creativity, and it was great. Because I could take this little sliver of this already obscure corner of cognitive linguistics and relate it to creativity. I was studying the distinctive characteristic of humanity and the future of the world. It wasn't until I had to teach courses on it that things changed. As many of you know in this room, teaching is hard. And when I started teaching, I found myself in a veritable conceptual hall of mirrors. And that from somebody who'd been studying irony earlier. what was I going to teach these students that would help them actually bring creativity into classrooms? Well, one of the issues we had to address is that in psychology, we don't only have a lot of different schools for looking at issues of creativity, we have very basic different assumptions. Is creativity something that happens in any group under the right conditions with the right stimuli? Or is there something intrinsic in individuals, in unique perspectives, where the brilliance of individuals are brought to the rest of us? Or are we all being creative all the time? Every sentence we say is unique. And what ends up being dubbed creative or undiscovered genius is a historical process or maybe just chance. So we have lots of different approaches to looking at this in psychology, but the issues go much deeper. When you start looking and really wrestling with this idea of creativity, and that's why I have the question up here, this is the question I've wrestled with for many years, you are in a veritable hall of mirrors of paradoxes and obstacles. For instance, psychology looks at how we understand human behavior and predict it. Creativity is, by its definition, unpredictable. It is novel. It is the surprise. It is very empowering as a concept, but that can be tricky because we bring it into a classroom or a school, and pretty soon somebody's going to want to assess or evaluate it. And pretty soon we're going to have a group of creative students and a much bigger group for the first time have a new negative label on them, not creative. And thirdly, we tend to think of creativity as juxtaposed to traditions, norms, conventionality. But the reality is we have no way of knowing if an idea is just wacky and confused or creative until a good deal of time has passed, i.e. until it itself has become canonical or a tradition. And that's for culture writ large, but it's not different in the classroom or the art classroom. If we have a 6-week art curriculum and we have structured it to get the students from point A to point B, and we have some idea of what the end is because that's how you develop a curriculum, but we have a student who starts out here, are we to look at that as confused or as creative? And let's say that that student is not doing so well in the rest of his or her academics. The stakes have just risen for that student's success in this project. Are you going to bring him or her on back into the fold or the plan, or are you going to let them work out here? Now, creativity we often think of in education as being specifically for those students, the ones who are maybe not doing so well academically in other ways, but have found a calling in the arts or another medium and are therefore going to find self-esteem and success in creativity. So it's not simple. Then I am left with my own challenge in teaching. I'm going to use my Air remote here, which is in teaching this to teachers. How do we come up with a way of thinking about creativity that's going to be practical, that is going to be theoretically coherent, and that is not going to gut the idea of creativity of the very essence of its meaning as something surprising, new, different? Well, here is my approach. I'm going to ask you today to take a giant step back with me, to think not of exactly how creativity works in the classroom, because many of you already know that, but to think about the dynamics of the concept of creativity itself and our place in that dynamics. I'm going to suggest, well, first of all, let me just make a couple of points. One, this is a relatively new concept, the way we think of creativity. There's excellent scholarship done on the history of the idea of creativity. And when you go there, you will find that the Greeks had no similar idea. They had many associated ideas that we would recognize as part of creativity: flourishing lives, intrinsic motivation, beauty, art, technique. But they did not have any idea of creativity. Inspiration, the Greek idea, came from outside as represented by the concept of the muses. Creare is a Latin word. It means to make grow. And not surprisingly, when there was a Latin translation of Genesis, it is in the first line of Genesis. For most of the Middle Ages, in most places, creare was reserved purely for God. God created things, men and women made things. In Renaissance, that loosens up a little bit, and we start saying people are creative. But this idea, this physics metaphor we use, of creativity as a force that's in people, in groups, in cultures, a force we can nurture, express, suppress, or maybe even kill. This idea does not occur until the late 19th and early 20th century. The scholars find the coinage of the first use of the word creativity in an 1875 book about the genius of Shakespeare. It does not appear in most other European languages till the early 20th century, and not in most English dictionaries until after World War II. This is a really new idea. Second point, this idea did not grow up all by itself. It emerged in concert with a lot of other modernist, very familiar modernist values and concepts from Romanticism that had come before. Some of those key values are also very American values: individualism, pragmatism, market economics, democracy. Some of the other ideas that were critical, that sort of laid the groundwork for creativity, were the idea of looking at a social group as a culture, the new importance of imagination and aesthetics, and the idea of genius. Okay, so now I told you I started in a hall of mirrors, and you probably feel like you're in a hall of mirrors by now. But I swear that I think it makes more sense. And so I drew a picture. I'm going to propose that we think about creativity as an ensemble of values, ideas, and people. Some of those theories of creativity we talked about before, there are humanistic theories, there are existential theories, there are theories about conscious development, there are theories about cognitive tricks or heuristics, and there's wonderful research on much of this. But there's this whole ensemble of ideas that then develop in relation to values and associated concepts and people. Now I want to, there we go. I want to emphasize people, because when you start applying an idea like creativity to people, you know, when I rant at my computer every day, it doesn't really care. It just keeps being as difficult as it was before. But when you apply an idea like creativity to people, so a lot happens. A chain reaction occurs. First, the people we start seeing ourselves differently. Then we start seeing our experience differently. We start classifying things differently. And we start behaving differently. And as we behave differently, we actually change what the concept is. So you're in what is really a looping effect. This is an idea that I'm adapting from the work of the philosopher Ian Hacking, where he talked about looping effects in relation to the ideas like genius. So we are actually participating in the definition of creativity. Okay, so now this seems all very academic, like something a disembodied head would have made up in some ivory tower somewhere. And you'll get that joke in a minute. But I don't think it is. I think it's very practical. Let me tell you a few of the implications, I think, of taking this approach to the idea of creativity. First off, it's a very complex approach, and there are many ways in, and there are many links here. So when I tell my students how I believe we should think about creativity, I advise them to think of creativity not in sentences, but in paragraphs. It is not, I want my students to be creative. It is, I want my students to be creative by exploring different ways of thinking about ideas. And in this art lesson, we can do that by using some of the cognitive heuristics for which we have good research, like exploring different metaphors. Or, my teenage students are wrestling with individuality. I want to give them more perspective on their own struggles by reviewing cases of creative artists and how they found the value of their own unique perspectives and lifestyles. So we have that, but we have a second issue here. If you look at all this over the last few hundred years, and you think about this historically, we rather paradoxically have a tradition here. We have a tradition of creativity. And I will propose that this is a very important tradition, one specific to our times, that makes sense for our times. You know, I told you that creativity developed in the late 19th century, and if you think about, early 20th century, and if you think about it, enormous amounts of change had happened in the way people saw the world and in individual lives at that point. Well, we have much more change today. So that is one of the reasons I believe this idea is so important for us. But it is part of our tradition for understanding, engaging, and managing change. Now, my ensemble idea suggests music. And I think that's a good way to think about this. Music is a complex tradition with a complex history, and so is creativity. Music also affects many other domains like dance, theater, religion, cultural identity, and so does creativity. It has its own sub-traditions within those traditions. And there are many ways to participate in the tradition of music besides being Stravinsky or Green Day. You can participate in music by collecting, by reviewing, through history, etc. And the same is true of creativity. There are many ways, many disciplines for participating in this tradition, including maybe even psychology. So, to sum up, click. I think that the implications of the approach that I'm suggesting are first liberating. In one sense, we are liberated from that question, what is creativity? We don't have to be worried if we're getting it wrong because we are participating in the definition. We need to be creative in exploring, using, and adapting theories. You're going to be exposed to a lot of fascinating ideas and performances today. Feel free to be inspired. Feel free to adopt, pick and choose, make it work for you. It is a tradition about thinking in the box and a tradition about breaking traditions, excuse me. So we can think in or out of the box. You can choose to actually explore the traditions creatively or think about how you work outside of traditions. But there are real challenges here too, because think about education. This actually shifts how we think about creativity from merely an evaluative criterion to actually a question for education. A question that we think about in music education or art education. We are participating, so there is a responsibility, and one of the key responsibilities that I think we face there is with our own students. Because we don't know, it is about surprise, remember? We don't know the world they're going to be in, and we are trying to help them understand how you take up a role in this tradition in a world that is changing because of the tradition. Thank you.
Thank you so much.